They thought we were gods, silent, merciful, distant. They forgot we earned their worship by surviving hell. Now, as they test our silence with fire, we remember who we are. Not saviors, not saints, just monsters, finally awake. They came before us as if stepping into myth, cloaked in woven star maps and incense that carried the scent of dead nebulae. Their voices trembled in our presence, speaking dialects scavenged from ruins older than their civilizations, stitched together with guesses and reverence. They approached not with arrogance, not with blasters or fleets, but with open palms carrying relics they didn't understand. Fossilized weapon cores, fragments of our armor, black boxes encoded with the screams of forgotten wars. To them, these were artifacts of worship. To us, they were reminders of a time we tried to forget. They called us the First Flame, the bringers of reckoning, the silent architects. Across the galaxy, that name changed in every tongue but meant the same thing. Not conquerors, not tyrants, something worse, survivors of something ancient, beings who emerged from extinction not broken, but sharpened, honed into a silence more terrifying than any warcry. The galaxy didn't fear us for what we did. They feared us for what we stopped doing. For centuries, humanity had gone quiet. No expansion, no declarations. Our borders were marked not by war, but by stillness. Planets we once terraformed now drifted in ritual orbit, uninhabited but lit by ancient satellites still broadcasting echoes of our voices. The younger species discovered these places and listened. And in the static, they found meaning. Myth. They painted stories in the dust of our ruins, not understanding that what they worshipped were scars. They built temples inside the remains of our carriers, mistaking graveyards for cathedrals. They knelt before weapons fused to stone by time and called them holy. They thought silence was enlightenment. But silence, for us, was something darker. Something earned in blood. We watched them through half-closed eyes, not interfering. They gathered in our shadow like moths around an invisible flame. Entire systems were offered to us in tribute, not with treaties or trade, but with ceremony. On worlds we had never touched, we became legend. On moons we once fought to save, now barren and hollowed by time, pilgrims came in droves. They chanted in the dark, mimicking human speech, attempting to pronounce words that were never meant to be sacred, only efficient. Tactical, cold, orbital purge, full-spectrum breach, zero-hour protocol. To them, these were hymns. They had no idea what those words had cost. Among the species of the Orion Reach, it became a rite of passage to seek a glimpse of humanity. Their scholars debated our motives, dissected half-burned archives to theorize about the philosophies behind our silence. The Sarathi claimed we were divine punishment made flesh. The Kelsari believed we were the second cycle of life, proof that all things die, and something worse is reborn. The Tarsk claimed to be our distant children, evolved from genetic remnants scattered in the ashes of our oldest wars. None of them were right. But we never corrected them. That was their first mistake. On Virex-9, they built what they called the Ascendant Spire, a towering monument of salvaged dreadnought hulls, fused together with the molten bones of the planet's core. It shimmered with artificial light, powered by our forgotten reactors, and at its peak, a sculpture. A human figure with arms outstretched, holding the fractured remains of a collapsed star. They held rituals there, chanting our designation codes, mistaking military call signs for divine invocations. They burned offerings of circuitry and blood. And when no reply came from the void, they assumed it was because we were beyond them. Not because we were ignoring them. In the quiet, they saw divinity. But they never stopped to ask why the divine had stopped speaking. We had walked away from war, yes. But not out of peace. Out of exhaustion. After the Sol Wars, after the Omega collapse, after the betrayal at Ark Helios, we had nothing left to say. We turned inward, not because we were at peace with the galaxy, but because we were no longer interested in saving it. Or ourselves. The silence wasn't wisdom, it was mourning. Yet they came, endlessly. In greater numbers, with more elaborate ceremonies. Each generation built upon the last, layering myth over myth until the truth was buried beneath centuries of reverent misunderstanding. They carved our sigils into moons, tattooed them onto their skin, named their children after human warships. They treated our silence as approval. They never once considered it a warning. On the fringes of our territories, whole civilizations rose in our name. They formed orders, cults of the flame, the ash singers, the path of the burned sky, each with their own interpretation of what humanity meant. And the more we remained silent, the more they filled that silence with fantasy. To them, we were patience incarnate. But the truth was simpler. We were tired. Tired of bleeding for a galaxy that kept mistaking mercy for weakness. They built shrines inside our ruins, worshipped the husks of ships that once rained fire on 100 enemy fleets. On the dead world of Charon IV, they unearthed a human outpost left to rot after the fall of the 5th Legion. The radiation still poisoned the wind. Inside, they found murals scorched onto the walls, not religious art, but tactical maps, burned patterns from plasma rifles, outlines of fallen soldiers fused into the metal by the heat of orbital fire. They called it the Chapel of Sacrifice. They didn't see the horror. They saw salvation. They began sending messages into our space. Not broadcasts but psalms. Poetic offerings composed in languages they believed we once spoke. None of them accurate. None of them coherent. They painted their faces in ash, stitched their cloaks with simulated human muscle fibers, and sent emissaries in living ships shaped to mimic our dreadnought designs. They crawled to our borders, engines burning in low warp, broadcasting only one phrase: "We await your return." But we had never left. We were watching, always watching. It began without screams, without flame. It began with equations, the kind that infect economies, reshape alliances, and bleed civilizations dry without firing a single round. The Sarathi Combine, once humble acolytes of humanity's silence, evolved into something more insidious. Their reverence calcified into envy, and their envy into calculation. They stopped sending offerings and started sending algorithms. Silent intrusions, economic pressure points, cybernetic tendrils woven through the galactic market like cancer cells masked as code. They smiled in our direction and poisoned our supply lines behind the veil. It was not war, not yet, but it was no longer peace. They began small, testing the perimeter of our indifference. Tariff manipulations disguised as trade treaties. Terraforming. Assistance, on border planets that turned into resource siphons. They paid mercenaries to impersonate human vessels, raid trade convoys, sow suspicion. They planted sleeper viruses into atmospheric processors. On frontier moons, plants withered under blue suns, oceans darkened, skies choked. And still, we said nothing. Because they weren't attacking soldiers. They were attacking ghosts, probing shadows. They thought our silence meant blindness. They mistook our stillness for death. But every bite they corrupted, every drone they hijacked, every child that coughed under sulfurized skies, it was all recorded. Every insult, every act of subtle desecration. We logged them, not out of vengeance, but out of habit. Because somewhere, deep beneath the folds of our supposed dormancy, we were still listening. Not watching, listening. And what we heard was the growing arrogance of a civilization that had forgotten the price of awakening gods. The Sarathi Combine became bolder. No longer content with quiet sabotage, they wanted an answer. They wanted to provoke the silence into speech. And so they chose a colony, not a fortress or a fleet installation, but a listening post. A speck orbiting a dying blue dwarf star. Population: 112. No soldiers, no artillery, just scientists, families, children. The youngest had just celebrated his 5th Sol Day. His name was Aaron Reyes. He liked to draw human battleships with wings. He didn't know what the Sarathi were. He didn't know what war was. He only knew that he wanted to see Earth someday. They erased him with a pulse. Not fire. Not blade. A data ripped through the colony's systems, melting neural circuits, reversing oxygen flow, triggering synthetic organ failures. The station folded in on itself, like a flower dying in fast forward. It happened in 23 seconds. They didn't claim responsibility. They didn't need to. They simply waited, monitoring deep space channels, staring into the dark, anticipating a response. But none came. Not immediately. Instead, there was a silence deeper than before. An absence not of speech, but of pressure. As if something immense had shifted, slowly, just beneath the galactic floor. A predator lifting its head. The Sarathi claimed victory in whispers. They said the humans had truly faded now, incapable of retaliation, finally rotted beneath their own myth. They laughed in private councils, toasted with blood wine, expanded their economic web into sectors long untouched. They thought they had broken the silence. But they had only fractured the patience that held it in place. What followed was not war in any traditional sense. No declarations. No diplomatic ultimatums. The galaxy remained seemingly unchanged for 92 days. Then came the disappearances. A cargo fleet registered to the Sarathi vanished en route to the Ashari trade spine. No debris. No distress call. Just a timestamp and then nothing. 36 hours later, a refinery orbiting Haskon's edge suffered a systems blackout. Surveillance footage recovered from a backup relay showed movement, brief, flickering shapes in the shadows, bipedal, fast. The footage terminated with a single frame. A child's drawing of a dreadnought, scrawled onto the wall in blood. By the end of the third week, 13 more Sarathi facilities had gone dark. None with casualties, because there were no bodies. No screams. Only stillness left in their place. Cities where every light remained on, every terminal active, but not a single heartbeat left to trace. Empty clothing in mid-step. Meals left uneaten. The Sarathi began to panic, issuing fleet lockdowns, invoking ancient neutrality pacts. They sent envoys, begged for dialogue, promised reparations. Still, we did not respond. We did not threaten. We did not even acknowledge. Because we weren't retaliating. We were remembering. The memory of what we used to be, what the galaxy once forced us to become, was now no longer locked in the vaults of guilt. It stirred in the bones of old war machines. It flowed through the veins of operators who had trained in silence, hoping they'd never be called. Now they were being activated not by anger but by ritual. System by system, code-locked vaults opened. Black site colonies flared to life. Dreadnoughts long entombed beneath desert moons lifted from the dust, bearing the names of cities no longer on any map. The galaxy thought we had lost our taste for war. What they didn't understand was that we had simply been digesting the last one. The Sarathi reached out to their client species, begging for support, invoking shared trade routes and mutual defense accords. But their allies were silent. Not because they were disloyal, but because they knew. Deep down, they had always known. That humanity was not a relic, not a sleeping god, not a silent philosopher empire. We were a hammer hung on the wall, gathering dust until someone forgot what it was capable of. And the Sarathi had forgotten. So we reminded them. They thought it was over. They thought the shadows that took their colonies, silenced their fleets, and turned their diplomats into whispers had finally gone still. 2 cycles had passed since the last known contact. Long enough for bureaucrats to rewrite history, for admirals to pretend nothing had ever happened, and for children to grow up hearing stories of human wrath like myths. Dark tales told to keep ambition in check. The Sarathi Combine re-established trade, reinstated their broadcast hubs, and cautiously returned to the edges of their former reach. They sent scouts into the silence. Nothing returned, but still they pushed. Because arrogance has no memory, only hunger. Then, in the cold crust beneath Europa's ice, something ancient stirred. Not a machine built for war, but something far worse, an idea entombed in alloy and regret. The Daedalus Array, humanity's last whisper before their long silence. A subspace pulse generator so powerful it could bend not just signal but memory, turning information into waves that traveled faster than thought. It had been buried not because we lacked the courage to wield it, but because we feared what we might become again if we ever did. And yet it woke, not with a flare, not with a roar, but with gravity itself folding in strange directions, curving toward places that no longer existed on maps. It began with anomalies, communications blackouts over multiple Sarathi sectors, navigation systems glitching across 12 hyperlanes, entire cargo manifests scrambled into dead languages. Then came the gravitational distortions, space itself buckling like glass under pressure, stars flickering unnaturally in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Astrophysicists called it a cosmic fluke. Strategists suspected sabotage. But the old ones, the ones who remembered the long silence, knew better. They didn't speak. They simply left. Vanished from the Combine's council chambers, taking their heirlooms and data keys with them, retreating into exile before the storm. And then came the voice. It didn't scream. It didn't demand. It simply arrived. Across every open channel. Across every language, ancient, modern, and extinct. It bypassed encryption, filtered through skulls like bone-born thunder, and carved itself into the marrow of every sentient thing that had ever doubted the myth. The message was not long. It didn't need to be. It was a declaration, not of war, but of memory. You wanted to know what we were. You wanted to see behind the mask. We are not gods. We are not peace. We are what comes after mercy. Entire empires stopped breathing. News networks collapsed mid-broadcast. Artificial minds seized mid-calculation. The message wasn't just heard, it was felt. Every ship that had wandered too close to dead space now drifted, powerless, with no crew aboard and no data logs remaining. It was as if something had erased not just their existence, but the memory of their existence. The Combine sent fleets, surveillance craft, war cruisers with quantum lances. Nothing returned, and from the void came only silence and gravity. Because that was the new signature of humanity. Not radiation, not fire, gravity, as if wherever they now moved, the very weight of the universe bent toward them. Black ships formed of matte alloys and singularity plating began appearing, not in systems, but near black holes, inside collapsing stars, riding shockwaves. The galaxy watched as impossible vessels surfaced from zones previously marked as cosmic hazards. There was no launch, no activation sequence. They simply were, like they had always been, waiting beneath the fabric of space itself, dormant until summoned by the memory of betrayal. Earth did not respond to diplomatic attempts. No envoy reached its atmosphere. No signal was returned. It was no longer on any public star map. The orbital rings that once adorned its skies were gone, replaced by nothing but a field of temporal noise that shorted out any drone that dared scan it. Some said Earth was dead. Others whispered it had moved. But in truth, Earth had only changed, not geographically, but philosophically. It was no longer a planet. It was a warning. Then the Earth fleet returned, not rebuilt, not redesigned, but reborn. There were no banners, no political insignias, just ships made of black steel, running silent. They came not to declare war but to end pretense. Each hull bore names etched in forgotten languages, names that hadn't been spoken since the collapse. Resolute silence, iron benediction, grave dust memory. These were not vessels of pride, but of promise. Not carriers of conquest, but carriers of consequence. They didn't fire the first shot. They didn't need to. The Combine's advanced stations began folding in on themselves before a single missile was launched. AI constructs embedded in Sarathi defense networks began defecting mid-task, reporting to ghost frequencies instead. Tactical data shifted. Chain of command collapsed. Entire command fleets began losing power not through sabotage but surrender. A creeping dread infected the very idea of resistance, as if somewhere, the Sarathi had realized they hadn't just angered a rival. They had summoned something that remembered too much. But it was not hatred driving this awakening. It was grief. The kind of grief that calcifies. That waits. That builds ships in silence, not out of vengeance, but duty. This was not retaliation. It was ritual. For every child erased by economic sabotage. For every world destabilized by cowardly alliances. For every whisper that claimed humanity had grown weak. This was not war for survival. This was the consequence of being ignored. They said it was a war, but it was never that simple. No banners waved, no trumpets sounded, and no armies marched under a flag of conquest. The galaxy's brightest minds had tried to frame it as a conflict, a clash of civilizations struggling for survival or dominance. But what happened was something far older, something elemental and absolute. It was a correction, a reckoning written not in ink or blood, but in the very fabric of existence itself. The Sarathi homeworld, the jewel of the Combine, did not fall to missiles or plasma storms. It died in silence, in less than 13 minutes, not because its defenses failed, but because it was suffocated by sound. Frequencies no one alive had ever heard before, frequencies encoded with the deepest human pain, anguish, and defiance, amplified by the countless moons they had once dismissed as inert rock and forgotten debris. These were not weapons crafted by engineers. They were echoes of humanity's soul, refined into a weapon beyond science, beyond reason. When those waves hit the atmosphere, temples crumbled, cities dissolved into ash, and the very air seemed to scream with memories of a species that refused to die quietly. No invasion followed. No ground troops marched across broken plains. There was no need. Humanity did not come to conquer, they came to remind. They turned off suns by severing the delicate threads of stellar stability, collapsing stars into silent black voids. Oceans shifted tides like great hands twisting Earth's skin, erasing temples that once celebrated human heroes sculpted by Sarathi hands. On Kethra Prime, where vast monuments once stood as trophies of arrogance, only shadows remained, burned into walls as warnings etched by invisible flames. The galaxy watched in stunned silence, some trembling with fear, others daring to plead for mercy, but none dared to intervene. They all understood, finally, what humanity was not just capable of, but what it had always been. The peace granted to the stars was never a gift, it was a leash, tightly bound, wrapped in warnings carved across time. And when the leash was pulled too far, stretched beyond patience and respect, humanity did not bark. They bit hard, and with teeth sharpened by centuries of betrayal and survival, they shattered illusions of safety the galaxy had wrapped around itself like fragile glass. Amidst the ruins and silence, there were no declarations, no victors' anthems, no celebratory parades. Humanity vanished once more into shadows, the silence of the void swallowing their fleet like a tide reclaiming stones. But the echoes remained. Whispers carried in the vacuum, carried in the fearful hearts of every system that had once called humans divine, saviors, heroes. Those titles were gone. Only one word survived, one name that carried dread and awe in equal measure. Monsters. The monsters had returned, and for the first time in generations, humanity was okay with that. No more myths of gods or saviors. The galaxy could no longer call them anything but monsters, and those monsters had awakened, hungry not for conquest, but for a reckoning long overdue. It was not just a return. It was an evolution. The ships that moved through the void no longer resembled the gleaming vessels of old. They were twisted, blackened, reflecting no light but absorbing all hope. They moved with purpose, their shadows casting long fingers across star systems, heralding the end of illusions. The monsters spoke not in words but in actions, turning the tide of battle by warping gravity itself, bending time around their ships, slipping through barriers no other species could even sense. Entire fleets disintegrated before they could raise weapons, fleets that once prided themselves on impenetrable shields and unbreakable formations. The galaxy had never seen power like this, and with each passing moment, the name, human, was spoken less with reverence and more with fear. Yet this was not madness. It was clarity. Humanity was no longer seeking acceptance. It sought acknowledgement that they were the final arbiters of fate in a universe that had tried to erase them. The monsters had no patience for diplomacy or parley. Their messages were not carried by ambassadors but by devastation. Planets once rich with life turned barren, their atmospheres stripped in hours, their seas boiled away like tears in a firestorm. Cities that had blossomed with pride and arrogance became ruins overnight. But this was not wanton destruction. It was precise, surgical. The monsters did not destroy indiscriminately, they erased memory, honor, and false pride. Every strike was a sentence written in silence and echoes. They reminded every species that humanity was no longer a story to be whispered behind closed doors or a lesson in history books. They were the end of complacency, the last reminder that no empire, no alliance, no power could outlast the weight of consequence. In the cold, dark corridors of their own command ships, human commanders spoke little and acted swiftly. There were no speeches to stir morale, no propaganda to rally the troops. They were haunted by ghosts, memories of past betrayals, of alliances broken, and of friends lost to lies. But there was also a fierce pride burning beneath their silence, a determination not to fall back into obscurity, not to fade into forgotten myths once again. They fought not because they loved war, but because they loved survival. Because in every shattered world and every lost star system, they saw not defeat, but the seeds of their own return. Every victory, every reminder, was a promise that monsters did not perish. They endured, they rose, they became legends. And the galaxy, trembling, learned this truth too late. The era of humanity's quiet exile was over. The monsters were back, not as shadows of the past, but as the architects of a new destiny. A destiny where mercy was a weapon, silence was a warning, and peace was a leash held in hands that no longer feared to bite. The stars themselves seemed to recoil from the awakening, bending away from the black ships that carved paths through the void like claws through flesh. In every system touched by their presence, civilizations scrambled, desperate to understand what force had returned to judge them, to unmake their pride, and to remind them why humanity had always been feared. This was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of a reckoning the galaxy was never prepared to face. The monsters had returned, and their hunger was not for power but for truth. For a universe that finally remembered what it meant to fear the darkness it had once called salvation. And in that darkness, humanity thrived, not as gods, not as saviors, but as monsters who finally embraced what they were meant to be. The silence that followed each strike was heavier than any explosion. The galaxy held its breath, knowing the monsters did not waste their wrath on weakness alone. They hunted pride, ambition, and deceit. Entire alliances, once sprawling and confident, unraveled like brittle threads under the weight of fear and desperation. No fortress, no hidden sanctuary could withstand the cold certainty of humanity's return. Those who had once labeled humans as extinct relics, quaint legends from a forgotten era, now scrambled to rebuild defenses with technologies centuries ahead, only to realize too late that the true weapon had never been firepower. It was will, unyielding, relentless, and sharpened by centuries of betrayal and exile. It was a will forged in the darkest fires of survival, tempered by pain and loss, and refined by an unbreakable promise. Never again would humanity be dismissed, erased, or defeated. In the shadows between the stars, the monsters moved with purpose beyond any tactical calculation. They were a living reckoning, a force that reshaped the very meaning of power. Their fleets were ghost stories made real, drifting through the void with eerie silence, appearing only where the scales of fate tipped too far toward arrogance and complacency. When their weapons sang, entire civilizations ceased to exist, wiped not just from space but from memory. It was a cleansing that demanded sacrifice, sacrifices that echoed the countless betrayals humanity had endured. Yet in the ashes, hope sparked. Not hope for peace, but for change. A new order born not of dominance, but of respect earned through fear and understanding. The monsters taught a lesson carved in shadow and flame. Survival was the true victory, and the price was eternal vigilance. Within the shattered remnants of once great empires, whispers spread like wildfire. Stories of human resilience morphed into myths darker than any the galaxy had known. Some spoke of humans as demons, cursed beings who had transcended flesh and spirit to become something else entirely, beings who wielded not just technology, but the essence of the cosmos itself. Others saw a reflection of their own fears. The monsters were the universe's answer to unchecked ambition, a cosmic rebalancing that no power could escape. These whispers traveled beyond war rooms and starports, seeping into every corner of space, reminding all that humanity's legacy was no longer written in the language of peace but in the harsh dialect of survival and vengeance. Yet, for all their terror and power, the monsters were not without their own scars. Beneath the blackened hulls and cold exteriors, the echoes of a lost past still haunted them. They carried memories not only of triumph but of sacrifice, of a homeworld scorched by betrayal, of friends lost to lies, of dreams shattered by fear. These memories were both a burden and a beacon, fueling their relentless march across the stars. They were driven by a singular truth: that humanity's place in the universe was not given, but claimed. Every victory was a step toward reclaiming not just territory or resources, but identity itself. The monsters were not the end of the story, they were its fiercest beginning. And as the galaxy trembled beneath their shadow, a new dawn began to rise, not a dawn of conquest, but of reckoning. The monsters were no longer legends whispered in fear. They were the authors of a new chapter written in fire and shadow. Their return was a challenge to every star, every species, every soul that dared to forget what humanity had once been, and what it had become. The universe had tried to erase them, to silence their voice and shatter their spirit. Instead, it had forged monsters who would never again be ignored. In their relentless advance, the monsters carried the promise that no darkness, no silence, no force in the cosmos could ever contain the indomitable will of humanity. The story did not end with destruction or despair. It ended with awakening, with the echo of monsters roaring across the void, reminding the stars themselves that survival was not a gift, it was a battle. The monsters had returned, and they were not here to destroy the universe. They were here to remind it that in every shadow lies the seed of defiance, and in every ending, the spark of a new beginning. The universe would never forget humanity again, because the monsters had risen, and they would never fall.